So there's been a pretty interesting thing happening that I've noticed. I was going to say in the last years or so, but actually I think this has been a long time coming, or at least it's been this phenomenon that has gone for several years at this point. I feel like maybe booktube isn't as big of a thing as it used to be, but I think that this is probably still a phenomenon worth talking about in the general book sphere online and probably in book talk. I mean, I don't really use TikTok, so I don't really know what's going on there, but I see a lot of videos on YouTube of people talking about these phenomena and their receptions. So the romance genre here and online in general, and presumably in real life as well, it's had this problem with drama and controversies and things like that, even outside of the topics of books and stuff like that. I mean, you may remember, if you keep up with this sort of thing, you may remember the one about the woman who basically faked her own death virtually and then went back online as if nothing had ever happened and decided that it was really not that big of a deal and that everyone should just forgive her immediately because people were bullying her or whatever. She acted as if people who had criticized her book deserved the grief of believing that they had drove her to suicide. Yeah, that was a real thing that happened, in case you didn't know, but that's not really what this video is going to be about. That's just one of the several examples of drama, big time drama, happening specifically in the romance literary genre. So yeah, that's pretty strange, isn't it? But there are other things that maybe are slightly less ostentatious but are still worth talking about. I think the romance genre, for as much as it is oftentimes the object of I guess mockery, whenever people want to give an example of bad books or bad literature of any kind, they typically will jump on to romance as the butt of the joke. Typically the joke is about 50 Shades being bad or Twilight being bad if they're a little bit stuck in the past, or some other new and trendy romance book. And of course, this is partly because those books are popular. Okay, so here's one where I ended up going off the rails. My point was to say that because the romance genre has been kind of ridiculed for a while, it figures that a lot of people who enjoy the genre, you know, the readers and the authors and all that, kind of have become a little bit more defensive about it. As a result, they have gotten a little bit more fiercely aggressive when defending it, to the point where they are taking criticisms that are valid or are not really an attack on the whole genre as if they were about that, or as if it were just a case of someone who hates romance or thinks it's dumb or what have you. Because there's a difference between saying, oh, this is just dumb, shallow romance or a dumb, shallow love story for girls, and saying, you know, there's these issues with this book, or maybe with this specific subgenre, with a specific type of romance or what have you. The books, the bad books that tend to get really, really popular and sell a lot of money and become movies and straight up franchises, they tend to be romance books a lot of the times, or at least they tend to be books that are very heavy on the romance. The point being that yes, the romance genre doesn't get a lot of respect, and I think people kind of have this idea that like romance must be inherently bad. I think again that's partly because of this idea, because their idea of romance are those books that are very popular and also happen to be bad. I am kind of the idea that typically the worst examples, or at least among the worst examples of any genre, also tend to be very popular ones, very popular examples. Aside from these ideas of whether the books themselves are good or bad in terms of how well they're written and how they make use of certain techniques or what have you. There's something else about romance and romance novels and romance adjacent stuff, as in fantasy romance, science fiction romance, etc., that whenever it's discussed, it inevitably blows up into a huge controversy. And that is basically the general circle and idea of having certain fantasies in relation to romance and sex, maybe. So, for example, and specifically this applies to what gets to be referred, usually is referred to as dark romance, which a lot of the times is basically just a subgenre that specifically represents abusive types of romances or Stockholm syndrome type things, things of the sort that aren't really, I guess, standard romance stuff, I guess, that are not very feel good, fluffy stuff. Whenever we discuss things like our inner fantasies and desires and things like that, there's a tendency, I think, both to negate them, to deny them, and to shame them, and also a tendency to defend them at all costs. And I think both are mistaken ways to look at them. I think that there is a way of discussing these issues that isn't either accusatory and judgmental, and also not like acting as if there's no issue with any handling of any topic at all. Of course, the main case in point here being Darkness Embraced, I forgot the name, I'm sorry. I think it's Tilly Collins. I think her name is Tilly Collins, by this British woman. She made, basically, long story short, in case you're not aware of the whole thing, this book came out a few years ago, I'm pretty sure, but it kind of has resurfaced as a controversy because it was initially kind of on the low. The book Darkness Embrace depicts a romance between a very high-ranking member of the Ku Klux Klan. A very high-ranking member of the Ku Klux Klan and a quote-unquote cartel princess, a Mexican woman, of course. But also, how could I forget that her name is Adelita? Like the woman, the most famous woman from the Mexican Revolution. She has a whole folk song about her and everything. I wonder if she took the name from that, or it was just kind of something that she heard or saw somewhere and she figured that it would be a good name. Sometimes it really baffles me that people don't really think it through that much. I know names aren't really that deep, and it is technically a plausible name, I guess. It would stand out a lot, though, I think, for a woman, especially a younger woman, to be named Adelita, especially in the diminutive version. But whatever, that's not even the main issue here by a long shot. And here's the thing, I'm never opposed to a specific subject being in a novel on its own. I've always said this and I will keep saying it. I don't think the concept is what makes or breaks a novel. It doesn't make it good, it doesn't make it bad, it's all in the execution. I do think it's kind of a questionable concept, I guess, but that's more because I don't have faith in most people to write something like that in a deep or thoughtful or even tasteful way. But I don't think it's necessarily impossible to do it. However, I think it's something interesting to talk about when it comes to these types of things that reveal a lot about the readers of these types of things, of these types of novels, right? What's interesting to me as well is that I saw some Mexican women, or at the very least Latin American women, defending this book as well. For the most part, they were criticizing it, but of course what's important to keep in mind is that certain groups of people are never going to have the same exact opinion on the same thing. And of course there's going to be Mexican women who are okay with one thing and those who are not. no matter what that same topic is. And I'm never gonna come in here and be like, oh well, I speak for all the Mexicans and I can say that we are all against this, because that's never going to be the case. And I think that it would be interesting to look into those women and why they accept and even want these types of things. What I think is this may speak to, this is kind of a hypothesis, but I think it's worth looking into. I think it speaks to a desire to be wanted in fictional and kind of fantasy terms by the same kinds of groups of people that would typically hate you, and this kind of idea that this man hates you despite of who you are because he can't deny himself how much he's attracted to you, basically. But the main issue that I didn't initially touch on, because again, this is unscripted and I just forgot about it. But the main thing really with these types of media that depict these romance stories is that it individualizes the issue and pushes this idea that you can just kind of love the racism out of someone, and in this case kind of lust the racism out of someone, and this idea that you can possibly be racist if you're dating someone of another race. And the other thing as well is that in reality, people who are quite racist will often have people who they see as the good ones, you know, people who they see as exceptions to those ideas that they have of those groups. Maybe because she's attractive enough that he can forgive her Mexicanness. But really that doesn't do anything for the issue as a whole, and for Mexicans in this case again as a whole. Because someone like this guy in real life would actually still have the same prejudices. They would just see this one person as an exception. Of course, I'm not saying that a real life person can possibly grow as a result of meeting someone that they see as an exception, but that's something that depends a lot on their openness to new ideas and not really on the experience itself. I think it's a similar concept to the general idea of a bad boy or like a mafia boss kind of romance, where like the guy is like the worst, you know, not the worst possible person, but like typically is someone who is expected to be really violent and very aggressive, but they make this exception towards the love interest, right, the main character in the story. And I think that speaks to the desires of some women, you know, in how they would like to be seen as an exception. But I think it's precisely these same feelings, this same fantasy that blocks any kind of critical look at this same type of fiction. What I mean is that those women that kind of block all kinds of criticism, and of course I'm only, in this case at least, I'm referring to the Mexican or Latin American women who responded positively to the novel and who defend the novel against the haters and even insult people who are criticizing the novel for its racism, of course, because it's easy to be okay with the novel if you aren't even Mexican, or if you are not even in a part of any group that would be targeted by the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, that's kind of goes without saying, of course, right? But yeah, there's women who would be part of that targeted group who also liked the novel, and they are so fiercely defensive of this novel, possibly again as a hypothesis, because of these desires and because of these ideas that come with a novel. And I do think that that's something that is not really as much of a moral or ethical debate. I guess what I think a lot of people believe or feel in the moment is that they can't reconcile these two things, right? The fact that they like this novel and the fact that this novel has aspects, or maybe even its own premise, can be considered racist, because a lot of people immediately go, oh, if I like this thing, or I get any enjoyment from this thing, and this thing is racist, then that means that I'm racist, and that means that I'm a bad person. And I have found this a similar issue as well when I talked about, coincidentally, I talked about racism in Native American / white woman novels. I know I've talked about, I mentioned that video a lot when I talk about these kind of things, but the thing is, if you have seen the reception that that video got, you would know, because people were really defensive about it. And one of the main arguments was like, oh, you're basically censoring, people are allowed to write what they want. And I mean, I think if you think about it for even one moment, you can see logically that I'm not preventing, and people who criticize these things are not preventing anyone from writing anything. We are just criticizing it or calling it X, Y, and Z. That doesn't prevent it from being published or being distributed anywhere. But I think that the specific reception to that book, to that video, even though if you watch the video, I never call or refer to anyone as racist. I say that tropes are racist, but I never accuse the readers, or as far as I remember, even the authors, of being racist. But it is inherently a label that is just difficult to put on anything at all, because people will immediately feel like they're being called a bad person if they happen to enjoy anything that gets that label thrown at it. One of the main ones in relation to that Darkness Embraced novel was that the book wasn't romanticizing the Ku Klux Klan for X, Y, and Z. For a lot of people would say because of this and that and the other, because the main character or the love interest had left the KKK by the time the book ended, and it was kind of seen as his redemption. And really, beyond romanticizing, you can definitely say that the novel was at the very least eroticizing at some points this enemies to lovers aspect, let's say. Specifically that line, for example, where the narrator says something about where Tanner, the Ku Klux Klan guy, is the narrator in that section, and he said something about how her big Mexican tits were pressing against his swastika tattoo, which is just baffling, isn't it? I mean, for so many reasons. And honestly, these kinds of things, again, are just very minute things, like whether or not the book was doing this one thing or not. It just misses the point of the whole picture, you know, the big picture. The fact that this book, and if you read passages of it, you will understand. And of course, you could argue that, speaking of that previous line that I just quoted, you could argue that, well, you know, that's the character's voice saying these things, you know, it's him giving this exotic fetishizing version of this woman. But this is still an idea that is presented uncritically by the novel, and that the author went out of her way to write down. And this is something that we have to remember every time we talk about something that is written in a book. It's not written accidentally there. Of course, that's part of the illusion. But when you think about lines like that, it really jumps at me, at least, that someone really wrote that. And it doesn't apply to just that line. There's a lot of lines, specifically when the Mexican woman is being described. The way that she is portrayed is such an obvious stereotype of like this spicy Latina, like, oh, of course she has this fiery temper fantasy of like the Latina who is tamed through this guy. Because I read half of the book, about half of it, by the way, and I have at least something to show for it, and I can tell you, first of all, that it's even cringier than I thought it would be. I mean, Tanner's narrative, it's every other word is a swear word. And listen, I don't care that much about swears. I've sworn in this channel before, and I don't really care. But when you do it every other word, it just makes you read it. It reads like a 12-year-old who just learned the word fuck and they think it sounds cool or something. I mean, it's really terrible, but anyways, that's beside the point. She is portrayed in this way, like this Latina who at first is really fiery and dominant, but then goes on, you know, you see her softer side, and this guy tames her and she becomes a little bit more submissive, which also is paradoxically a similar idea that people have of Latin American women, that they are not tainted by feminist ideas and therefore they are better housewives, they are more submissive, while also having that hot temper or whatever, and that really don't help us being seen as humans that go beyond, you know, our sexual components or beyond sexual beings. But my point with this whole thing is that when people react to these kinds of criticisms, they have this idea that like, oh, if this thing is bad, then I can possibly enjoy it without also being bad. No, that's not what this is all about, you know. It's not about you personally liking or not liking the thing. It's a criticism towards the work itself, and it's not about the readers, not inherently anyway. I mean, if you do see a video talking shit about people who like Darkness Embraced, then that's another thing altogether. But if the video is about the novel itself, then it has nothing to do with whether you like it or not. A lot of people don't want to consider the possibility that maybe this thing is bad, or it has aspects in it that are maybe flaws or imperfect or whatever, and I also enjoy it. Like, it's just difficult to reconcile that for a lot of people. A while ago, I was actually planning to make a video about rape fantasies in literature. Of course, typically they appear in romance, and specifically in historical romance they are kind of a full-on cliche. So I think something somewhat similar applies to this, which is why I get that a lot of readers reacted to this criticism saying, well, it's dark fantasy, so like you should expect it to be dark, therefore to have all these unethical things going on, which is kind of a cop-out, but that's another thing altogether. But I think one reason that they did try to bring it up is that, well, these novels have other unethical things happening in the novel, and those don't really get criticized anywhere near as much, or they're nothing new when they happen. And yeah, that's absolutely true, you know, things like rape that are romanticized don't really, you know, don't really cause that much of a fuss. But let's put it this way. For one, I sure hope, I mean, I was gonna say the KKK and racism aren't a kink, but it's more like I sure hope they aren't, right? Because I mean, I am sure I don't have to explain why, but of course things like rape fantasies are a real kink, and I don't think they're a kink that's wrong to have at all, which is of course why it appears, and it's very common, which is why it appears in a lot of these novels. And it doesn't necessarily appear in a very tasteful and thoughtful way either, you know. A lot of the times it's really crass and it's very unapologetic. And like I said, this is something that I guess I can see why people initially have the instinct, I guess, to simply go on and defend it on that same basis, right? Like it's just a sort of fantasy or a kink or what have you. But I also think that even rape fantasies are something that you should maybe question about yourself. I do think that it's something different when it comes to something so specific and so present as anti-Mexican bigotry, I guess, and something that not all readers, for one, are necessarily going to be acquainted with and are necessarily going to be critical of. And I guess for some people it's this almost like this extreme version of an enemies to lovers kind of trope. Like it's kind of taken to its most extreme, or one of its most extreme versions of it. Like two people who by concept are supposed to hate each other, but they fall in love, right? Like it's a thing in romance. It's like the most standard thing and the basis for a lot of ships out there that people are devoted to. But when it comes to this specific thing, I mean, this real life thing of this specific hate group and this specific form of bigotry, even by the standards of what the book is doing, it still could have done it in a more critical and tasteful way while still having the same concept. I think even if you don't like the concept and you hate it on principle, you could still agree or maybe argue that this is still a bad example of that concept, because it's pushing the same ideas. In a way, it is pushing the same ideas that it's supposed to be against, that it's supposed to fight against. And I think that happens a lot when people have this idea that bigotry or racism, I'm gonna say bigotry because Mexican is not really a race, it's a nationality, but when people have this idea that bigotry is like being rude against someone and kind of like being rude against someone, but in the case of racism specifically because of the race, or racism is only racism or bigotry is only bigotry if it's outright violent and like it ends in death or something like that. But that's not really the case. And I think this book also follows the same problem of presenting bigoted people as being rude and the good non-racist people as being nice. Because I think something that is important to acknowledge is that actually racist people can be really nice until you turn out to be slightly different from them. And that's something that, you know, is so surface level, but is worth putting even in a romance novel. Like, oh look, maybe this person was nice at first, but as soon as they realized that this character was Mexican, they immediately became hateful or whatever. That's the kind of thing that would be at least worth putting in there, because it's not like you need to be convinced that a character is evil by them being rude or abusive or whatever. You don't have to be convinced, you know. The fact that they are bigoted that much against Mexicans is like, but don't you think that's bad enough to make them into the antagonist or of the series, the book, the movie, or whatever? Now, of course, this is not in any way exclusive to this one book. There's actually quite a few examples, particularly of novels where a Nazi soldier, officer, or whatever will fall in love with a Jewish woman or something like that. There's a lot of books like that. This kind of romance isn't even like subversive at this point or revolutionary at all, because it's been done so much actually. And I don't actually have a dislike for this concept as a whole. In fact, let's think of, for example, American History X and Jojo Rabbit, which are two ways in which this trope is done kind of like that, but not really, but I think in a good way. Partly because American History X, it does it in a way where it's more of a friendship rather than a romantic thing between the hateful racist character and the, in this case, black character. And you could say that, you know, it's still kind of a cliche and it's still flawed in certain ways, but I still think that it's a movie, that movie manages to not romanticize neo-Nazis. I think something that this movie also makes clear is that it's not about making the bad character simply a bad character. In this case, the way his redemption is a way to humanize him and to kind of make you understand how someone becomes that way, how someone turns out to be that way, and how they're not hopeless, you know, there's still something that can be done. In the case of Jojo Rabbit, that is a little bit more bordering on romance, because I do think that, you know, the kid, because the kid does kind of end up having a crush on the girl. If you don't know, it's a World War II movie about this kid who kind of like starts to idealize Hitler and Nazism and all these things. And then he finds this Jewish woman. Well, actually, she's a girl as well. She's, I think, his age or like one or a couple of years older, maybe. But he is initially rejecting. He's initially very bigoted against her, obviously, but you know, he starts to know her and starts to see her as a human being, and over time it's more like he starts to have a crush on her. And the whole thing is mostly platonic, I would say. I feel like the moment where you make it more overly romantic or more straight up erotic is kind of the point where you have to really stop yourself and just make sure that you're not romanticizing something that you shouldn't, you don't want, that you wouldn't want to be seen romanticizing, you know. And I think that's also kind of what baffles me a little bit, you know, the fact that people are not even that bold about it, you know. Someone actually said in one of the comments on Cindy's video about the same topic, they were like, you know, if you're doing something like this, why aren't you bold enough to just be like, I don't care who criticizes my novel? Because that's something else that I find kind of baffling about this whole thing. Because I mean, if you write a novel with this concept and you publish it, surely you must at least think, I don't care who criticizes it, right? Because you must be expecting criticism. But for some reason, it's almost like they're shocked. Can I just say at this point as well, like, one of the many things that really jumped out to me this year specifically is that so much American media about Mexicans is revolving around the cartel. Like, do you people not know anything else about this country? But anyways, that's basically why I think that this whole debate is just not going to go anywhere, or at least I don't have a lot of hope for it, because it's just the kind of thing that people are bound to get really offensive about. And of course, after all, it's not really just romance readers. In fact, I think that as a whole, it's very difficult to criticize anything that any kind of media really that anyone has any attachment to, because of course people are bound to get defensive at that sort of stuff. You know, you can't criticize anything, and certainly not call anything in it as being racist or anything like that, because it's bound to get people pissed off. I mean, there's just no way around it, whether it's a book or a movie or a video game or whatever. I mean, of course, this is not in any way a phenomenon that is exclusive to romance readers. But again, I have certainly noticed that out of all of the reviews or general discussion videos that I've given, that video has been the one that has the most negative reception. And from the comments, it was very clear that a lot of people who do like to read it didn't like to hear any sort of criticism on it, no matter how tame or non-accusatory it was. So I hope you got something out of this video, whatever that might have been. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.